The American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, was a dark and difficult time in the history of America. Many lives were lost and more than 620,000 soldiers gave up everything on the battlefield. Yet even in the middle of all this fighting and sorrow, there were people whose quiet actions made a big difference. These people, like Harriet Tubman, didn't just stand by. She guided slaves to freedom through the Underground Railroad. Then, there were the soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment who showed unshakable courage. But they weren't alone. Others worked as spies, nurses, or abolitionists, each playing their part in shaping history. So who were these brave souls? Let's talk about the great things they did that really made a difference in history. This war, the American Civil War, is often called the one that broke the racial game. It changed how people thought about race and freedom. Before the war, slavery was deeply rooted in the South, and many people believed in the separation of races. But as the war went on, things began to shift. The fight for freedom wasn't just for the Union. It became about breaking the chains of slavery and giving black people the right to live as equals. Considering the racial discrimination, our first hero is someone who also broke a chain alone. Dorothea Dix. Before the American Civil War, the role of a nurse in the United States was mostly held by men. Women knew of Florence Nightingale, a British nurse who served on the battlefield, but in America, society had strict rules. A working woman was often looked down upon, especially if she came from a well-to-do family. It was a time when women were expected to stay in the home, not step out to care for others in the world. However, when the war began, the Union Army faced a serious shortage of medical staff. They quickly realised that women could fill this gap and decided to accept them as nurses. In June 1861, Dorothea Dix was appointed as the first superintendent of US Army nurses. She was careful in her selection, wanting nurses to be strong, healthy, and moral. She also believed that nurses should be plain in appearance, not too young or too beautiful, so that their work would be taken seriously. Under her leadership, over 3,000 women answered the call and served the Union. Next, we have Harriet Tubman, known to many as a brave conductor of the Underground Railroad. When the Civil War began in 1861, Tubman took on a new role, using her sharp mind and courage behind the battlefields. She became a spy and military leader for the Union Army. In 1862, Tubman travelled to a Union camp in South Carolina, where formerly enslaved people had found refuge with Union troops. There, she worked as a cook and a nurse, but her work didn't end there. Despite not being able to read, Tubman became invaluable to the Union. She organised scouts, gathering crucial intelligence to help Union forces and mapping out territories, waterways, and the positions of Confederate troops. Her quiet strength and cleverness made her a powerful ally. In 1863, Tubman did something no other woman had done before. She became the first and only woman to lead a military expedition during the Civil War. With great skill, she led 150 soldiers on 3 federal gunboats up South Carolina's Combahee River. Their mission: a surprise attack on the plantations of secessionists. Using intelligence she had gathered from freed people, she guided them safely past hidden Confederate torpedoes. Along the way, they freed more than 700 enslaved people, with many of them joining the Union Army afterward. Tubman's success knocked the Confederacy back and really hit their morale hard, showing that they were losing their grip on the South. And then Tubman continued to gather vital information, leading more expeditions and offering her insight to the Union Army. One general even hesitated to let her leave South Carolina, knowing her value. He said her services were too important to lose, for she could gather more intelligence than anyone else, especially from the newly freed people. On the third, we have Abraham Galloway. He was a man of great courage, driven by a fierce desire to free others. Just 3 years after escaping slavery in the cargo hold of a ship heading north, he returned to the South. determined to bring freedom to others, even daring to free his own mother. Fearless and tireless, Galloway quickly became the kind of master spy the Union Army needed. In the heart of enemy territory, Galloway posed as a slave to gather valuable intelligence on Confederate troops. He set up a network of spies in the South, using his connections to encourage enslaved people to rise up and fight for their freedom. His efforts helped raise 3 regiments of United States colored troops, giving thousands of black men the chance to take up arms for their own liberation. Though Galloway never learned to read, his powerful voice and ability to organise gave him the strength to fight for black rights in ways that words on paper never could. He was part of a delegation of 5 black leaders from the South who travelled to the White House, demanding that President Lincoln support civil rights for African Americans. Galloway also helped establish state and local chapters of the National Equal Rights League, pushing for equality across the country. His tireless work continued even after the war, and in September 1865, he played a key role in leading a Freed People's Convention. His fight for justice didn't end with the war. In 1868, Galloway became one of the first black men elected to the North Carolina legislature, where he battled violent voter suppression from groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Despite facing constant threats on his life, Galloway led an armed black militia in Wilmington to protect his people from intimidation. His courage paid off. He and 2 other black men won election as state senators, and 18 black men served as representatives in the North Carolina General Assembly. During his time in office, Galloway voted for the 14th and 15th Amendments, helping to grant citizenship and voting rights to black men. Now, the last hero is Susie King Taylor. Born into slavery in Georgia in 1848, Susie King Taylor defied the laws that kept African Americans from learning to read and write. She secretly received an education from tutors while living with her free grandmother in Savannah. After escaping slavery with her uncle, Taylor joined hundreds of other refugees at Union-occupied St. Simon's Island. At just 14, she became the first black teacher to openly educate African Americans in Georgia. Later, she married Edward King, a black officer in the 33rd United States Colored Infantry Regiment. Taylor worked as a nurse, laundress, and teacher for the soldiers, even learning to handle a musket and becoming an excellent marksman. While nursing at a hospital for African American soldiers in South Carolina, she met Clara Barton, the future founder of the American Red Cross. After the war, Taylor and her husband opened a school for African American children, but when he passed away and the school closed, she moved to Boston and worked as a domestic servant. In 1902, she became the first African American woman to write a memoir about her Civil War experiences. Her book, Reminiscences of My Life in Camp, reflected on the fight for freedom and the racism she faced, leaving a lasting legacy as a hero behind the battlefields. Now, we want to know your thoughts on this. Who do you think made the biggest impact behind the scenes during the Civil War? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Take care and see you in our next video. Thanks for watching.